Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Q&A today. We are so excited to have with us Sylvan Creekmore from St. Martin's Press. And also with us is Bunmi Ishla, who is the board chair for The Word. I am Vinyanka Prasad. I am the executive director of The Word, a storytelling sanctuary, who's bringing this to you today. Just a few words to start us off here. If you are not super familiar with our organization, we are a group that is filled with publishers and writers from marginalized groups, and we put programming into the world to help marginalized voices' stories make it to your bookshelves. So we have a couple of things going on right now that are that we're so excited to share with the world. The first one is our editor-writer mentorship, which we are so honored to have Sylvan as one of our mentors this year in our 2020 program. The Editor-Writer Mentorship is a program that pairs an upcoming writer with an editor who has experience in the field, acquiring, editing books, knows what the publishing world looks like. And that's really a gap that we've seen in the past, that that a lot of our upcoming writer friends don't really know what to expect from the publishing world, don't know what that looks like, don't know what it is about their manuscript that isn't quite ready to make it into that world, or why they aren't making it forward, even when they feel like they're right on the edge of that. And so we've been able to, for the last couple of years, put together writers and editors and really get those manuscripts into their best form to get ready to send to agents and to editors for acquisitions. And by the way, we have some really exciting news that our adult fiction mentee from 2019 actually just sold a manuscript. So we are super thrilled. And we know that in so many ways that this mentorship really provides that leg up and, just an extra boost in, whether it's that the manuscript itself gets purchased and sold, or it's that, it's that there are all these underlying things that help our writers progress into the next stage. And the other part of what we're doing today is also that this is part of our Margins community programming. If you haven't heard of Margins, it is a conference for writers from the margins. We know that that kind of space has needed to exist for a very, very long time, and we are putting it together. Obviously, 2020 looks a little bit different than we thought it would. And so while we thought that we would gather all together in the same halls and soak one another's energy in that way, we have changed that into a virtual conference, and we will still gather energy from one another and connect with one another. And instead of being stuck with just one weekend for the conference, we now have freedom to share programming for a couple of months before that even starts. And so this is our very first part of our Margins community programming, and I'm thrilled to now throw it over to Bunmi and Sylvan, and they've got a lot to talk about the publishing world. Feel free to share your questions as we're going along, and we'll have time for those as well. Thanks for joining us.
All right, good morning, everybody. Sylvan, doing well this morning?
Yes, so far everything's been going really well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get to chat.
Well, I'm really glad that you're here. Just to get us started, I'm wondering if you would share what you feel the role of an editor is when it comes to that writer relationship. I know editors have a lot of different hats, but when it comes to working with the writer, what do you feel like that role primarily entails?
Sure. So I think it's twofold, and it depends on the part of the process that the project is in. So when you work with an editor, from the point of acquisitions onward, it's going to be anywhere from a year to 2.5 years before your book is actually physically on the shelves. And part of that process will be the editing process, where you'll go back and forth with your editor on revisions and discussing ideas and making the book the best book it can be. And then the second part of that process, once the text is done, will be the actual publishing process within the house. So for the first part of those, anywhere from 12 months to 2.5 years, your editor's role is going to be as a mirror, a sounding board, a little bit of a teacher, a another set of eyes to look at something, because fundamentally writing is about communication. And so you have to make sure that what you have put on the page comes through to somebody else and comes through in a way that is going to be successful for more than just one other person as well, in a larger, towards a larger audience.
Yeah.
So your editor's role is to read and digest and then give you feedback to make the book the best it can be in both the sense of art, in the sense of storytelling, and in the sense of marketability, so that you will actually reach the readers you're looking for. And then once the text is done, your editor's role is to be the window into the publishing house, because publishing houses can be very small. They can be, a boutique publishing house. They can also be behemoths that can feel very bureaucratic from the outside and even from the inside, and difficult to penetrate. So yeah, it's your editor's job to know everybody throughout the process, to have personal relationships in-house that can help shepherd the book onto its final destination on the shelf, and to funnel all of your questions and that you don't know where to direct to the right people, so that you get the information that you need.
Yeah, great. Just out of curiosity, you were talking about even the acquisitions phase. When you are looking at books that come in from agents or even from directly from writers, what are some of the things that stand out to you in a stellar submission?
To me, there are things that can be fixed and there are things that cannot be fixed in a project. And so the things that stand out to me, which tell me that a project is ready, even if it needs to be worked on, are that the book knows what it is, it knows what kind of book it is, and it knows what it's trying, what story it wants you to get from it, what story it wants to tell, and that it also has at least two characters that are fully realized people that have a relationship with each other. Because that relationship is, to me, what propels the story forwards. And that can be enemies, that can be siblings, that can be best friends that either find a friendship or fall out of a friendship, that can be a love story. There are so many different ways that relationship can look. And if you're writing a crime novel, that can be your relationship to a mystery and a dead person, and whatever that ends up pulling you through the story. But you need to have characters that are full and that a reader can connect to, and you need to have a sense of the story that you are telling that is clear to your reader. Yeah.
What about the things that you feel like can't be fixed? Because you mentioned obviously there's things that can be fixed and can't be fixed. Like, what are some things that you're like, ugh?
If you're writing a story, if you're writing a book, I'm going to preface all of this also. I edit commercial fiction. I don't work on literary fiction. And so when one works on literary fiction, to a certain extent, that's a little beyond what I do. But there is an art to it, and so there's a finesse and an art to it that that also has to be right. But I don't work on that. So what I'm talking about here is commercial fiction, which to me means that you are reading for story and for connection, and so that's where all of my answers are going to be directed towards. Yeah. So even if you have this really good idea for this plot that should work, or a setup, you really think that this hook or this niche is going to be really interesting to an audience, and then as the book goes forward, there's no vivaciousness to it. It doesn't feel like it takes on a life of its own. There's nothing particularly organic about the way that the book works. I think it's just not the right book. It's just not flowing well out of you. And there's no way to go back to an author and say, put more life into this, because you're essentially saying, make this better, which is the worst edit you can give, because there's nothing to do with that. So sometimes a story, sometimes it's just not clicking, and it's just not, what you should be working on at the moment. And that's heartbreaking, because, there's no way to fix that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So imagine I'm a first-time writer. You just acquired my book.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you would initially begin with as far as just preparing me for this journey, since I've never done this before?
Yeah. So a good editor should start off by giving you a schedule, a very rough outline of what the next 6 to 18 months are going to look like. Okay. And that will include everything from how long the editing process is going to take, how long they expect you to get revisions back to them, and when you should expect to see things like covers or get blurbs for the cover or start to drum up excitement in-house, that kind of thing. So your editor should really walk you through the process so that you have a structure in mind as you move forward. And then the other thing that they should do is give you edits. That should happen pretty quickly after your book is acquired. Oftentimes you will have had a phone conversation before you have picked an editor to make sure that your vision for the book meshes with their vision and the house's vision, so that you don't, get forced into publishing a book that you didn't want to publish. So you'll have had a conversation of some kind, but it's perfectly acceptable to ask for that conversation in writing so that you have a written record of the edits that you talked about. You can ask for a letter, you can ask for track changes, whatever you will make your job easier. You can also ask to have another phone conversation so that you can really dig into edits and move forward. I've done all of those things.
Cool. When you were working with also first-time writers and first-time authors, what are some of the, I guess, some of the biggest or most common things that you are helping them develop, or does that kind of vary a whole lot? And what are that you feel, well, let's just start with that question, actually.
Start with that. Okay. And so you mean develop in terms of, literally editing in the book?
Yeah. So
plotting, honestly, plotting is really difficult. And what I mean by plotting is that you have to lay out your book in a way so that every scene necessarily comes where it does. It couldn't be moved around and the emotional story would still make sense. You have to make sure that every emotional beat that you're hitting makes sense along the way, so that when your characters are mad at each other, it comes at a moment that is after some emotional payoff, so that there's tension there, so that you're building on what you've built, and you continue to raise the stakes with every scene that you've got. And so it's about that. It's about logically putting together where you want to take the reader next emotionally, and making sure that your scenes and your relationships are in such a way that they could not be another direction, and you're taking your reader very specifically where you want to go. So that's usually what it is. It's usually about saying, this area sags, or this area doesn't seem to know what it wants to be doing, or it goes off in another direction, or it's a really important scene and you have it in the wrong place. Let's move it over here and it will gel better and make more sense. And once you've done that large structural work, you can feel the emotional outline of the journey of the book, and it should sort of feel like it has settled. It's sort of like doing the parts of the puzzle that, like the edges, and then like the clear parts in the middle where you can see all of the pieces that should go together, and then you're left with a bunch of like white pieces, and you have to carefully go through after that. And that's the line editing and the finessing the character work and those smaller bits of editing.
That makes sense. So starting with the big picture first, and then like getting more deep and nitty-gritty. Are there any expectations or demands that you've ever had a first-time author put on you that you kind of had to like manage and realize, let's pull back, that's not exactly my job, or and just kind of any of those types of situations?
I've had authors because I work on both fiction and nonfiction. We're obviously talking mostly about fiction here. So I've had nonfiction authors who often have a day job that is outside of being a writer, want to start promo right away because they already have connections and they want to, drum up support. And you have to be really strategic. The book has to be done. If you're promoting something, you have to have a book to promote. And the way that you get excitement for a book, honestly, is by getting other people to read it. And then they tell other people to read it, and then they tell other people to read it. So you have to really put one foot in front of the other. You can't jump a step. So it can be difficult sometimes to make sure that an author is thinking very strategically about who they're going to ask to promote their book, how they're going to use their energy so that it's well used, and you're actually going to get returns on what you put out into the world, and that kind of thing. I've also had authors send me mood boards for their covers immediately, which is great. Like, we want that. We want that input from you. It's so helpful to know how you see your cover. But if you send it to me at acquisitions, I'm going to put it in a folder, and it's going to sit there for a couple of months, and then I'll take it back out and I'll send it to art when it's actually time.
Yeah, that's cool. That's funny. I mean, I can imagine, like, I will read some authors and they even have like entire playlists and everything else they've created to help create this mood. And so you're like, I don't need that just yet.
I'm really glad you have it. It means you have a really clear idea of your story, but like,
yeah.
hold on.
Yeah, definitely. When you are thinking about just kind of like developing the craft and helping the writer with their craft, has there been anything that really creative as either a strategy or something that you've done with an author to really help them in the editing process? Because I definitely know traditionally like there's this editorial letter, but I'm sure there's other ways that you've helped maybe support a writer or jolt their creativity. Any creative ideas that you've done?
For the very first time, I had an author who wanted to basically talk at me. I've never had that before. They wanted to like, they happened to live in New York City, so it worked out. But we got together and they sat down across from me and we redid the outline of the plot. And they were just like, but what about this? But that doesn't make sense. But what if I did this? But what if, et cetera, et cetera. And I literally, like, my job was to sit there and go, and, or like, I don't like that as much, or like just little bits of like, because they really just wanted me to be a sounding board and a mirror. And we did that a couple more times over the phone. And I've never had an author want to work like that before. So often writing is such a solitary activity that I find that authors want to absorb and then go away and work and then come back with questions. And this author really wanted to like bounce and be collaborative and play off of me in a way that I hadn't before. So that was really interesting. And that one also, because it's a road trip novel, included a lot of logistics. And so a lot of what we were doing was coming up with practical roadblocks. What are the problems that they could encounter that would enrich the story and become obstacles to their eventual end goal, so that the author could then build emotional stakes around those practical stakes. And that was really kind of fun to be like, how do you siphon gas out of a car? And, what would it look like if you, how much do hotels cost in the middle of nowhere? How like they're diminishing money, and like, where would they get more money from? And what are the characters they could call on to support them through this and that kind of thing. So it was fun to do that kind of logistical plotting.
Cool. That's really cool. Now I want to read that book. So you're gonna have to learn about it when it's like ready to go. You mentioned that you edit both fiction and nonfiction. So I'm curious about how does that editing process look differently? I do know that some nonfiction books aren't finished when they get acquired, while fiction usually is complete. Usually. So how are those two processes different, and for you as an editor and even for the writer?
So in a nonfiction, in the process of acquiring nonfiction, the only kind of nonfiction that's generally submitted as a full book is a memoir, because that sometimes reads a little bit more novelistically. And so sometimes you will submit a memoir as a full manuscript. Most nonfiction is submitted on proposal, which means that it comes with a general overview of what you want the book to be, a chapter breakdown, and then some sample writing, and then sometimes some other sections in there as well. And that's because with nonfiction, often there is a research component to it. And so what you are doing is paying the author money to then go do the research to finish the book in a way that doesn't apply to fiction.
Yeah.
And so when you're editing nonfiction, or at least in my experience editing nonfiction, because the nonfiction that I edit is narrative, which means that it is supported by personal story in some way. I work on pop culture and social criticism and essays, and a little bit of like pop science, pop psychology, which also has a sort of social criticism angle to it. So who the author is matters to me in terms of why they're writing about the subject that they are and what their personal story brings to the work. And so because of that, it still has a narrative structure to it. You still have to be looking at emotional beats and what the sort of emotional climax is and where we're building to. But in a similar way to fiction, the building blocks of it, why is this chapter here and not here? What is your argument in this chapter? What information have you given the audience that you can then build on in the next chapter? And what is your logical argument? Are you, in a sort of like grade school paper kind of way, have you started with a thesis chapter, and then are you breaking that down into other chapters that support that thesis that ultimately end up in your conclusion and, bring us on this sort of necessary logical journey? Is that a chronological journey? Is it not? Whatever that ends up being. So it's a little bit more analytical and a little bit more like editing a research paper than fiction, which often ends up being like, I really just don't feel like he would have done that in this space.
Yeah. With nonfiction, do you oftentimes work on it like chapter by chapter, section by section? Is it just kind of whatever the author has finished?
It's whatever the author wants to do.
Okay.
I always make sure that I do at least one edit of the full book because, somebody is eventually going to read the book front to back. And so you want to make sure it reads front to back. But if the author wants feedback on chapters, I'm happy to do it that way. If we're a little crunched for time, sometimes it's easier to edit in sections, whatever that ends up being.
All right. So like if you were to acquire it based on the proposal and you're kind of paying them to do the research, or you're paying them to do the research, you won't even see the book or anything until I'm done. Or
yes. Oh yeah. So that's the other fun thing is if you buy something on proposal, and even you can sometimes buy fiction on proposal where somebody will write usually 75 to 150 pages of the book and then give you a very detailed synopsis of where the plot's going to go. You acquire that and then you just don't see the book for 6 months to a year, and it eventually shows back up and you're like, oh right, I was really excited about this. And so that's really fun because you sort of get it's kind of like getting to read the book a second time because you sort of were told where it was going to go, but you were really excited about it. And then you get like all of this new material that you get to dive back into. So that's always a really fun feeling to, have, it's like having your own personal fan fiction writer where you're like, I really like this, write me 6 more chapters.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, good. Now I get to read this again.
That's so cool. And I mean, I'm going to ask about nonfiction first, and then I'll go back to the fiction part. But with nonfiction, does the author ever like reach out to you in the process of them doing their research and writing to get feedback and ideas from you, or you are for the most part hands off until the full manuscript comes in?
They're usually very specific questions. Sometimes they run into a snag and they need to bounce something off of their editor and get feedback on, the project has taken a different direction than they expected it to.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's legal questions. Sometimes they want to include something that they hadn't thought of before because of the way the world has turned and a current event or a difference in public opinion. So in that case, yes, you would reach out to your editor usually and get some feedback, but usually it is not the same kind of larger structural question. They're more specific.
Okay, that makes sense. And then on fiction side, buying a book on based on proposal, how likely is that for a new author? Is that something that you would really only do for an established author that you either published before, or at least they have some, history with writing enough books that you can trust that their work is strong enough?
It almost never happens on a first book because you have to know that the author can write a full book. Having a detailed synopsis does not prove that you can finish a book and that it will work and actually tell a story. So it almost exclusively, I'm never going to say never because, who knows, but it almost exclusively happens on a second, third, 10th book. And yes, that can happen both when an author is selling their next book to their same publisher. Usually you don't have to write the full book for that. You'll write an idea out and they'll give you, they'll purchase the second book based on the idea. And it can also happen when an author has published a couple of books with one house and is moving to work with a different editor in a different publishing house. And so they've proven that they can write a book. And so they'll write a proposal with a synopsis to it. The only thing, it very much depends who the author is, whether or not that affects how much money they will get. For the vast majority of authors, non-blockbuster authors, the fact that you don't have a finished book means that you will get slightly less money because the risk is greater for the publisher because there is not a final book.
Yeah.
But that, the balance there is that you get your money sooner, which is really good for some authors who need their money to, live on. Whereas if you take the time to write the full book, you have to delay getting your money, but you might get a little bit more.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's go back to pre-acquisition stage. I'm a writer and I'm working on getting my book ready for submission. What are some things that I should think about and consider? I think a lot of writers, you have different categories, the ones who've edited a million times and had beta readers and other people and everything else. And then those who are still newer to writing their first book. I just am curious about what advice you would give new writers as they're preparing themselves for submission, things they should definitely make sure they check off their list before they either submit it to an editor or even an agent and feel like they're ready for that process.
Yeah. So the two things that I would say, sort of regardless of how plugged in you are, it is true across the whole spectrum of the amount of work that you've put in. Have other people read your book, and not just your mom. Although your mom is actually a really good place to start, because sometimes you need the first person that you need to read your book needs to be somebody really, really safe. So it can be really good to start with, your partner, your best friend, your sibling, whoever the person is that is just going to say, this is the best book you've ever written, because you need that. Sometimes you need that confidence, and that's really good. And then you need 10 other people who have no emotional stake in you to be like, I don't get it. I don't know what you're trying to say. And then you'd be like, all right, cool. So I'm going to fix that. And then after somewhere between, I honestly would say 5 and 10 people have read your book, not all at once, at various stages, and you've worked in between each of those stages. And you have learned how to listen to what someone says and think, they have tapped into something that I was trying to do, and I'm going to work on that. Or they didn't understand, and I'm not going to listen to that bit of advice, because those are very important bits of feedback. And you need to know the difference between someone who is pressing on something that you were going for that didn't work, and someone who missed the cue entirely and thinks you've written a different book and wants you to change a book in that direction, because that's a skill as well. So you need a bunch of people to read it to make sure that you are actually effectively communicating and that you've done your revisions so that the book communicates what you want it to do. But you also need to develop the skill as a writer of listening to feedback and learning what is useful feedback and what is not useful feedback. Once you've gone through those 2 stages, you also need to make sure that you have read what is working currently. You have to read, I would say, somewhere from 3 to 5 books that have been published in the last 5 years. And then at least 3 of those should be in the last year that have worked, or that you like, that you think are similar to your book.
Okay, that was my question. Whether it should be similar to your book or completely different, or
similar to your book. Yes. And by similar, I mean, you think the same person would pick up this book. So it doesn't mean, I don't mean like, hyper specificity. You don't have to find a book that it has exactly the same plot and exactly the same main character as your book to prove that your book is going to work. That can actually be, if you can find 5 books that are literally the same as your book, then maybe somebody's done it already, unfortunately. But if you can pick up a book and say, I like this book, and I think that the person who liked reading this book is going to like my book, that's what you're looking for in terms of a comparable title. So read a number of books in that area to have an understanding of what people are looking for right now, what has been out there in the market, and also just to demonstrate that you are knowledgeable about the kinds of things that are both going to bring readers to your book and also compete for readers with your book.
Yeah, which, I mean, I guess that also brings the question, I mean, when we compare comp titles in the publishing world a lot to say, hey, this book did really well, this is a book that's very similar. How, I guess on the editor side, how would you work with a book that maybe doesn't seem to have comps out there, but you also feel it's a really great story, especially because when we think we're talking about like marginalized writers and how certain stories sometimes seem to not be told as often. And so there's not as many comp titles out there. Exactly. So how do you work with that and try to figure out a workaround to show that, hey, this book has readers out there and here's how I improve this?
Yeah, that's always, particularly in the case of marginalized perspectives and perspectives that haven't been given the space to show that they're like demonstrate that they have an audience. A huge part of that is going a step deeper. And so instead of saying, this is a book about an Asian American character with cerebral palsy who is able to, get her best friend back because they had a breakup. Like, you don't have to get that hyper specific. What you say is, this is a story about friendship and overcoming obstacles, and you sort of go to the core of the conflict underneath that, and then you find a book that deals with that core conflict in a tone that is similar to your book, and in a an emotional way that is similar, because you will be able to find a book that is emotionally similar to yours, even if you cannot find a book that has some of the specific details that are underrepresented in the market. And so that's also what we end up doing if we acquire something and we think it's really it has an audience out there, and the the publisher is saying, we don't know how to position this because we don't know who the audience is. And so we don't know how to say, this is XYZ kind of book. You will like it because you like those kinds of books. You have to go through and pull books that have worked, that fit on a more universal level, and, create a larger story and a larger context for this book to work in. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. A really great way that we like to do it is this sort of, X meets X kind of, it's a combination of book A and book B. And then you can sort of do a Venn diagram of overlap and sort of squeak in the middle there sometimes.
Yeah, that's cool. That's good advice as well, too, because I think it's really easy to say, like, well, there's no book out there like mine. But I do think that there is a universal human experience that everybody can relate to, whether it is, losing a friendship and trying to get it back, or a bad breakup, or just like difficult dynamics, or even a great road trip or something, right? That you can tap into those things. And I think that's really great advice for writers who are feeling like there's, how do I find those comps? So thank you for sharing that. Well, one of the reasons why we're having this conversation is because you are going to be one of our editor mentors for this mentorship program. Can you share a little bit about why you decided to be a mentor, and what value you think this mentorship would have?
For sure. So I'll answer that question by giving you a little bit of background on why I'm in publishing to begin with.
Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah. So I've been in traditional publishing now for 7 years, and that I got my first job directly out of college, and it was very much like I wanted to be in publishing. I talked to the people, I figured out what I needed to do, and I did all of those specific steps in order to get into publishing. Because when I was 13 or 14, as many people in publishing are, I was a voracious reader, and I read particularly a lot of very classic high fantasy novels. And for me, the thing that eventually clicked that I just wasn't seeing, even though at the time I didn't realize why I was hungry for it and not seeing it in the books, there just weren't any queer characters. There weren't in anything that I was looking for. And when I would go into Barnes and Noble and look for books, or Google them and try to figure out what the books were, there were a couple of contemporary books, one or two about queer characters, and they were mostly very sad, interestingly, and that wasn't what I was looking for. And I felt really awkward talking about that with people, because it didn't feel like a thing that I should be telling people that I was looking for or missing in my books. And I turned to fan fiction. I discovered real full-blown fan fiction universes a little bit later than everybody else, and discovered this entire world of queer writing online, full of its own tropes and stereotypes and archetypes and bad writing and good writing and huge fandoms. And it just blew me away that people could write one story, an original story, not even a piece of fan fiction, but an original story that was as long as the first 4 Harry Potter books combined. And they had a following of 30,000 people who had read it and commented and were asking questions and were drawing fan art of the characters and were invested in these stories. And my thought, at this point, I was deep into the community. It had several years down the line, and I was in college, and I had this moment of why aren't we paying these people? They're good at what they do. Why are we not paying them for the content that they're producing? That there's clearly an audience for who are going to this community for that content, because it's not out there in the general media landscape where they can actually consume it. And so I had a long back and forth of, do I go into traditional publishing? Do I try to do something non-traditional and pay these people directly? Do I learn the rules first? Do I break the rules before I've learned them? And I eventually came down on the side of, no, I'm going to go into traditional publishing and learn the rules and try to understand the structure and change it from the inside, which was the project. And so I showed up in traditional publishing, and it was a incredible masterclass in the way that you market a book, the way that which means you identify a readership for it, and you then brand it in such a way that you market as, there is a purple audience and this is a purple book. And so you purple readers are going to like this purple book because we've colored it purple. And that's so specific and fascinating and completely different from the process of writing and liking books and being a fan and talking about them, and was really, really, really necessary and fascinating for me to learn, and then take that and sort of turn it and apply it to what I was looking for. And then I felt particularly lucky because a couple of years into being at the publishing house, learning, absorbing, not really feeling like I was contributing all of that much. Right around, this was like 2015, I think, there was a kerfuffle because one of the large trade book shows where people get together and get excited about books a number of times a year, there was a panel that I think was mostly young adult literature, and every single panelist was white. And people finally got together and said, what the actual fuck? And it was really cool because all of a sudden this conversation was happening, and I could sort of pop my head up and say, yeah, I wanted to talk about this a while ago, and I felt young and didn't feel like I could talk about this. And so I felt lucky because I didn't have to start the conversation. I could contribute to it once other people had started it. And, you know, sort of, it felt like the thing that I had wanted to be doing started rolling down the hill. And so I got to jump in and start pushing the ball along with other people. And so since then, the conversation in publishing has changed tremendously, which is great, by which I mean the door opened. I don't know that we've all walked through the door, but the door opened. And so I have been able to identify my colleagues who are interested in uplifting marginalized perspectives and including perspectives that have been excluded. And because of that, we've been able to support each other and create a community within the publishing house in order to support these projects and, you know, pay people, which is sort of the ultimate goal.
And so with all that, you're now mentoring.
Yes.
And what do you think the benefit of being a mentor will be to a new writer?
So the benefit is that publishing is incredibly opaque. And one of the reasons that I decided to come in and learn the rules from the inside is that it's you even Googling beforehand, when like I knew that that's what I wanted to do, I was trying to find as much information as I possibly could on what a publishing house did, how to be an editor, how to get a job in publishing. And it's really hard to find.
Yep.
And the way that I figured out how to do it was by talking to people. And the reason that I was able to talk to people is because my mom had a friend who was a writer. And so it was one of those things. And then I went to a college that had connections. And so, because I was in this school, I was able to talk to my English teachers, some of whom were authors, and they knew people. And so, it was that kind of thing. And it was through the people. And so being a mentor and being one of those people that people can, come to and ask questions is the only way that the information gets out and gets, it becomes more transparent and is given to other people. I will step back a little bit and defend some of the gatekeeperiness of publishing. Just briefly, I know that publishing can, because it is so opaque, can feel like it is full of really racist, classist, terrible gatekeepers, and it is. But the reason that it has been set up that way is that it takes a lot of emotional energy to engage with an emotional product, a piece of art, and an artist. And it's really hard to work with bad art and bad people in a deeply emotional way. And so there are these many, 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 many layers to publishing in order to make sure that the best people with the best intentions and the best books make it to the top, theoretically. Yeah. I think that the challenge then comes in making sure that those gatekeepers come from enough perspectives, backgrounds, and educations that they can adequately sift through the deluge of writing that comes our way. So I don't think that the idea of the structure is wrong. I think that the execution of the structure is wrong. And it is wrong because of the enormous crap of the country and the way that it has existed for, 300 years.
Yeah, like we need diverse publishing professionals just as much as we need diverse books. And so, and it's hard to get diverse books if you don't have those diverse publishing professionals, because yeah, you, like you said, it ends up, you have these people who are very narrow in their point of view. And when you are, I guess, like, what are you most excited about when you think about getting to mentor a writer through the word? What are you hoping maybe you, I mean, I know you can't, you haven't seen any submissions yet, and but kind of like, what are you hoping for? What are you excited about?
Well, I mean, the what I'm excited about is the reason, the thing that I get excited about with every book, and the reason that I'm an editor at all, is that when you connect with someone and give them feedback, which I try to make as theoretical as possible. I really like to ask questions. I don't like to offer solutions. So I would much rather say, I'm not sure this is working. Why did you do it that way? Or what do you think this character is feeling in this moment? Or what was the goal here? And then have the work, be taken away, have the author take the work away, and then read it and see the changes that they made, and just see them have, like, the way that an author can tap into what you were getting at and just like totally rework something, sometimes by adding an entire scene, sometimes by changing a couple of things around. Just gives me goosebumps. It's really magical to see that happen and see a book sort of like blossom and come to life. So that's what I'm really excited about, is to get to work on a good book, read a good book, and then also see an author make really good changes.
Yeah, cool. And I'm really excited to see what submissions we get in so that you can get to do all that pretty soon. Before, let's kind of go back to, I guess, just the publishing industry. We've been talking a lot about writers as a whole, but some people who are watching might also be interested in working in publishing. Do you have any advice for someone who wants to work in publishing, who potentially comes from a marginalized background or in an underrepresented community? What steps do they take? One of the things that you mentioned already was the fact that you had these connections. You had opportunities already that allowed you to speak to people. Mm-hmm. If I have none of those connections, how do I go about starting to build them so I can also learn and potentially get my foot in the door?
Yeah. So you have a really great tool at your disposal, and it's called the internet. And it's, it's a slippery, prickly, hypocritical beast, but it can connect you to people that you didn't previously have a connection to. Twitter in particular is a wonderful, wonderful there's a conversation going on in publishing full of a lot of different people, and that it is a little easier as someone from a marginalized background to have a voice in that community. At the very least, it is easier to find other people who are from the backgrounds that you are from and connect with them. So I would say, tell everybody that you want to work in publishing. At some point in your conversation with everybody, that should come up in your day-to-day life, because you never know whose brother has written a book, and who might be willing to chat with you about it, or who works at a magazine, or someone whose family friend just lives in New York City and might let you go sleep on their couch for a couple of days. So that's the first bit. You might think you have no connections, but you might have some amount of connections. So tell everybody that you want to work in publishing. And the second thing is, talk about books in some capacity. You can, something that actually we find to be really good experience is working in a bookstore. So if you have a local bookstore, go work in the bookstore and talk to the people in the bookstore about the fact that you want to work in publishing, because somebody in that bookstore at some point talks to a publisher and buys books from them. And there is a connection there. If there isn't a bookstore near you, or getting a job isn't a possibility, you can write reviews of books online, start a book blog. And even if nobody follows it, that's not the point. The point is that you are showing your good opinions about books online, and thinking about them, reading what's currently out there, and being smart about it. Because eventually you'll be able to say, oh, I have a book blog. Someone can look it up and they say, oh, this person is smart. This person is thinking about books. This person has good ideas. And that goes a long way towards showing that you will be good in a job down the line.
Yeah. I was just thinking about your advice. In my own experience, I work in publishing, but I came from education I was like, I had a similar story to you as far as why I wanted to get into publishing. And my first connection was, I was listening to a podcast, an editor was on there, and I kind of just Googled her, I found her email address and sent her an email. And that was my first step in like getting the connections that I needed. And it kind of spiraled from there. And then when I got my first job in publishing, one of the things they said was like, you worked at a bookstore at the same time you were a teacher. That was so attractive to us. And so I think that's great advice that you gave, just because at least from my experience, it kind of is what worked for me. So for for those reminders.
Yeah.
And do you have any like advice, or do you know if there's anything that readers can do that would help support diversifying publishing, and just kind of like what the gatekeepers
buy
like
books, be fans.
Okay, buy books and be
buy books and be fans. The single biggest thing that will help a book is when people buy it. And so if you like a book, tell everybody that you know that you like the book and make them buy it. There was a project that came out from a different division of my company last fall called Gideon the Ninth, which is, by the way, a fucking amazing book. If you like fantasy literally at all, it is a fantasy sci-fi horror novel. And the log line that they put on the front of the book, the like tag for what it is lesbian necromancers battle in a castle in space or something like that.
Title again?
It's called Gideon the Ninth.
Okay.
And it has a woman on the front with skull makeup on and a sword. And it's really, really good. And it's so weird. It is fantasy, sci-fi, horror. It is like necromancers on a planet in space with skeletons. And like, you can't pitch that. That's a bananas pitch. You just can't do it. And it's so good. And they were able to tap into the right audience and position it correctly and build a word of mouth campaign. And the book absolutely took off. And the publishing company definitely didn't expect it to do that. It's also queer. I don't know if I mentioned that. It's also incredibly queer, which is the sort of marginalized perspective narrative here. And So the publishing company didn't expect it to do as well as it did. But within the first couple of weeks, it had completely sold out and they had to reprint copies and they were actually behind in printing, which we sort of never want to be. And so that was an instance where the people in-house really championed the project and set it up really well and managed to get it out to a really, really wide audience that really wanted the book. And still the publishing company didn't necessarily believe that it was going to work. And then people bought it. And it worked. And that demonstrates a huge audience for that book. And that will help the next book down the line and the next book down the line and the next book down the line. So buy things, tell people to buy things, and then be really vocal about your support in any way that you can, online and in person.
Okay. Is there a place that you would suggest people go to look for these? Like, I mean, as far as how do I start looking for books that might be a little bit, I mean, I might be on Bookstagram or a podcast to get recommendations, but those are not going to be the types of book that like Gideon the Ninth that you just mentioned. It's so
well, they could be. They could be if you find the right tastemakers in those environments. Right. So what you're going to need to do is find a podcast that is devoted to, Black fantasy or Indian American writers or disabled voices or whatever it is that you are particularly interested in. And they're out there. There are blogs that support those kinds of, very specific identities. And there are also, more general blogs and podcasts and Twitter followings where there are people who are specifically looking for all marginalized perspectives. So you can go out and find those. And I would also say your independent bookseller is going to know a lot about what is in a book. And so go into an indie bookstore and ask.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's all good advice. Like we have to do a little bit of legwork ourselves if we want to really see the industry look different as well. So thank you for that. Going back to writers, do you have any resources like that you would say that new writers should definitely check out?
Yeah, I'm because I am not an agent, I don't have a bunch of these off the top of my head. So the other part of this process that I would actually just like to quickly backtrack is that before you submit your book to an editor, you are going to need an agent. And there's a lot of information online about how to get an agent. I unfortunately don't know specific sites off the top of my head, but you can Google it. It is there. It is available. Because your editor works for the publishing house. Your agent works for you. And that's really important because even though you want to have a really good professional working relationship with your editor, when it comes to things like money and logistics, they are ultimately not on your side in the sense of like their job isn't to be on your side. They might be a good person who is on your side, but that's not what their job is. And your agent's job is to bother your publisher into making sure that you don't get taken advantage of. And also your agent's job is to know the publishing industry and who wants to buy your book. So you'll need to get an agent. And there's a whole process of querying that goes into doing that. There's a lot of resources there. And similarly to when you talk to your agent about how I'm sorry, when you talk to your editor about how they edit and what kind of relationship you want to have with them, you have to talk to your agent that, if an agent offers you representation about how they work, and if you want to work with them, you have power. You can change your mind. You can make choices. You don't have to jump at the first offer to buy your book or the first offer or representation that you get. And you should make sure that it is a good relationship that you will be excited about. So I know, unfortunately, I don't have any resources off the top of my head because agents tend to be the ones who put those resources together because they interact with authors first before editors do. But if you, it sounds shitty to say it, but if you Google it, I am sure that there are good resources of who is a good agent, who is not, communities that can talk to you about that kind of thing.
Yeah. And actually, you just talking about agents and the difference between an agent and editor actually reminded me of a question I was going to ask earlier in the editing process. Is there ever a point when you and an author disagree about what needs to change in a book?
Yeah.
And kind of like who wins in that battle? And like, I feel like I've heard rumors or people, writers sometimes talk about like, well, they made me change this and that's not how I wanted it or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, do you make an author make changes or kind of how does that really work?
Hopefully it doesn't get to that point. And unfortunately, if it does get to that point, it's usually because the relationship is not as good as it should have been. And the author or the agent the author or the editor think that the book should be different than it should be, whatever that ends up meaning. The editor is always going to think that they're right and the author is always going to think that they're right. And so to be as impartial as I possibly can in this scenario, if it's really minor, I always let the author have it. If I don't think that it will jeopardize the book, I let the author have it, even if I think it's wrong, even if I think that it's something that's going to, bother me. I think readers are going to pick up on it and be annoyed by it. But if I think it is going to jeopardize the book, I think they have made a problematic choice. I think that they are letting authors or readers down in terms of how they've ended the story, or whatever it is. I'm going to fight with them about it. And if I ultimately think that it makes the book unsellable in some way, which is like worst case scenario, that is dramatic, that is very down the line. It has happened like twice in the last 7 years. And they were with, it was with very particular kinds of relationships with authors. We might choose not to publish the book. And that is a very dramatic, very, very, very rare situation. And so, I would say like 99% of the time, the author, whatever, do whatever you want. I think you're wrong. Fine. 1% of the time you are throwing away this book. And for some reason, I feel like we can no longer publish it.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know that it's 99% good versus otherwise.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's wrap up our side of this conversation. I was just wondering if you'd offer maybe some recommendations, a book that either you have read that you really love or a book that has shaped you in your journey. And then also, like you mentioned, nonfiction, if there's a favorite nonfiction.
Well, okay. So the favorite, a really fun piece of nonfiction that I read recently that I highly, highly recommend is called Because Internet, and it's by Gretchen McCulloch. And it is about informal language on the internet and how she's a linguistics professor, and so it's about internet language and the way that people talk in different communities on the internet in slang and memes and various other things. But it's also a really fascinating history of the internet for the last 25, 35 years, especially people who came into the internet within the last 15 years and don't know what it was like before then. It was really fun to me to read through and see the bits that I remember from my early high school years and go like, oh God, I remember we used to do that. But I love it whenever people take sort of non-dominant, non-highbrow culture and treat it seriously. And so it's a really wonderful examination of the writing of preteen girls and Black communities and just like communities that are often shifted to the side in terms of academics and the impact that they have on culture. And it's a really good book. It's called Because Internet, and it's by Gretchen McCulloch in terms of nonfiction. And I literally have to pull up my Goodreads to like remember what I have read that was good, that I really liked in the last couple of years, because I have read a lot of things. I was late to the game on Graceling. That is 10 years old. it is a fucking good book. It's a YA fantasy novel from the mid 2000s, and I just read it recently in quarantine and loved it to pieces. The later books become more diverse than the first couple are. I think, some of the fantasy worlds that she's got building have like brown skin. And that's sort of as far as it goes. But There Will Come a Darkness and As the Shadow Rises by Katie Rose Poole are two other epic fantasy novels. There Will Come a Darkness came out last year, and the sequel, As the Shadow Rises, is coming out later this year. I got to read it early because I work in publishing. Sorry. Those are both really, really wonderful Mediterranean, like truly Mediterranean, because I think they said that it was Greco-Roman inspired, but it's like very clearly includes Egypt and Israel and like Turkey inspired cultures all the way around the Mediterranean, which is really wonderful. It's just really, really good book. And Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas is the last. That's the one I knew I was going to forget if I didn't look at my list. So Cemetery Boys is a contemporary fantasy YA novel. It's a debut. It's by an author named Aidan Thomas, and it is a queer, trans, Latinx, Bruhex story about a trans boy who wants to prove that he is a Brujo to his family and be accepted for who he is, and goes into a cemetery and raises a spirit, and then can't get rid of the spirit, and the boy follows him around and causes a bunch of trouble, and then they fall in love because of course they do. Really
cool, awesome. And then curiosity, do you still read fan fiction?
I do occasionally, yes. I tend to read old standards. I like my good, like Marauders era Harry Potter fan fiction standards that I'll go back and reread them. And a couple of years ago, I read a trilogy called the Captive Prince trilogy by C.S. Pacat, which is another fantasy trilogy. It's very, 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 very good, incredibly good trilogy, and has one of those stories where the characters are so visceral that they're just like begging you to write fan fiction about them. And so I dove deep into fan fiction from that community after I finished that trilogy. And so I still have some of those saved on my phone from AO3 that I'll go back and reread.
Nice. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Sylvan, thank you so much for taking some time out this morning. We're going to throw this back to Bianca for her to wrap it up. And then, so thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. So much good advice. And yes, have someone other than your mom read the book. That was a good gem to take away. And, some of our, we had a comment about it's really important to not have to try to find a comp that showcases the same demographics necessarily, that there are so many other points of connection that we can be looking for to show that the readership is wider. And that's, kind of one of the things about writing from the margins is that there's a weird block about marginalized voices, as though we aren't all human beings, and we aren't all in places of connection with one another. And that's sort of the whole point of what we're doing here. It's wonderful to hear the recognition of that from the publishing space. And I think, and we really thank you actually also, Sylvan, for that. This was such an easy conversation, and it felt so approachable. And I think that's one of the things that like newer writers struggle with a little bit, is that the industry seems so big and scary, and who are these editors? And it's really nice to just have this in the world, to know that the person who is going to take that book and make it into a reality is someone like you, who just wants to love it and care about it just as much as the author does. So thank you so much for all of your insights.
My pleasure. Yeah, we're readers. We're in this because we're fans, and we want to be a fan of your book.
Absolutely. And I want to kind of go back to one of the things that you were talking about, which was building community, both as folks who want to enter the publishing space, but also as writers too. That's such an important part of how to move through either one of those career paths. And that's actually kind of brings me back to that conference that we were talking about, the Margins Conference, which is a space that voices from the margins all get to come together and really build that community. And I just wondered if you had thoughts about what writers can kind of be looking for in a conference space, and how they can make the best use of conferences and the resources that are available there.
So the first thing that I'll say is something that you feel like you usually end up learning it at camp or when you go to college for the first time or whatever it is that everybody else is as scared as you are, and all that anybody else wants is for someone to come up and talk to them and like start a conversation. So you should do it first because they're just as scared as you are. And the way that your conference is going to be the best that it can possibly be is when you come away with it with connections, not just from the presenters and the faculty members, but from the other authors that you meet in the community or in the conference space that will become your community over the next many years. So go talk to people and be nice and be friendly and ask questions and start conversations. And other than that, same thing, ask questions of the presenters. I usually in a conference space, I would say it's totally fine to hang out afterwards and ask them questions after the panel and just shake their hand and say your name. I know that doesn't work as well in a virtual space, but usually you can find them on Twitter and you can just, pop onto something they say and say, thank you so much for coming, or like whatever it was. It's perfectly fine to do that kind of thing and make a connection there.
Good advice. I know that a lot of writers are a little introverted, and that can be a little intimidating sometimes. Yeah. But actually, that's kind of an advantage of a virtual space, and that's kind of one of the things that we're hoping that our virtual space will be, is a space for connection and finding ways to get the writers and the speakers all connected, even though it is virtual. I think we can kind of break that down and still have ways for people to be talking and asking questions. So that's good to remember.
Yeah, and remember also that the presenters are there because they want to give you feedback. They want to hear from you in some capacity. So they're expecting it, and it's perfectly fine. And you're not imposing on anyone as long as you're polite and you thank them for their time. It's absolutely okay to talk to presenters and faculty members.
Well, we learned much today. Thank you so much, Sylvan. And
my pleasure.
Are just thrilled to have you as one of our mentors this year. Our adult fiction mentee is in for a really great ride.
I'm excited.
We are all excited. So everyone, the mentorship application is open now. Will be open until May 16th. Thank you again so much, Sylvan, for being here with us today.
Of course, I'm really glad that I got to. Thank you so much for having me, and I can't wait to engage more with all of the community here and the mentees when they come in.
Yeah, awesome. Well, have a great rest of your Saturday, everybody.
You guys too.